everybody. Welcome to Lincoln House. I'm Armando Carbonell. I chair the Department of Planning and Urban Form here at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And it is always a pleasure when we have a lecture to present here, but especially when we have a new product to unveil, a practically brand new product to unveil, in this case a book, with a lecture followed by a reception and a book signing. And I hope you all stay for the reception and book signing. Julie Campoli is a longtime associate of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, co-author of several books of note. The first, which came to my attention a number of years ago, she co-authored with Beth Humstone and Alex McLean, and it's called Above and Beyond. And it made me think that we could use the vehicle of aerial photography and the kind of analysis that a landscape architect and urban designer like Julie can provide to help people understand a whole series of options around land use and urban form and development patterns. And indeed, that led to our working with Julie and Alex McLean on a volume called Visualizing Density, which I hope many of you have had a chance to see and use. And it is still available, a very nice companion to the new book we're going to be talking about in a minute, Made for Walking. But the experience we had with Visualizing Density very much made us want to continue working with Julie. Among other things, we put the catalog of images of different examples of density up on our website, and that catalog is also available as a CD. And we discovered that this was a tool that people could use in public meetings and discussions about zoning decisions, and that it was very much a practical way to help people have a conversation about density and learn more about what density really means. Now it happens when this book came out, we very proudly brought it to one of our board of directors meetings and passed it around, and the directors were all very excited about it, except for one who's a very good friend, who looked at it and said, Armando, you know, this is a nice effort, but it's just no good because people can't interpret aerial images for the most part. They just won't be able to understand it. What you really need are images at ground level. That's the way people really understand space. And I was set back a little bit, but I said pretty quickly, well, that's a great idea. As long as we can afford to do another book, we could do something like Visualizing Density at ground level. And that became something of a working idea for a second volume, which we then set Julie to work on. And over time and much labor and more time and more labor, we began to learn that density probably wasn't just the most important thing in the world, that it was important, it was misunderstood, and we contribute to a better understanding of it. But it's not all about density, it's about a number of attributes of places that work very well as pedestrian environments. And I'm not going to take away anything from Julie's talk, but she's going to tell you about those things. But the thing to remember is not just the D of density, but 5 Ds. You will know what those are. And a P, that's very important. So with that, 5 Ds and a P, Julie Campoli is going to lead us through Made for Walking. Again, books will be available afterwards at the reception. And Julie Campoli.
Thank you so much, Armando. So many of the people that helped make this book possible are in the room, so I'm going to take a few moments to say thank you. First to the Lincoln Institute for funding the research and the writing and the publication and the promotion of this book. I'm so grateful to support me in the work that I love to do. Second to Armando for imagining what this book could be and finding the resources to make that happen. To Lisa Cloutier, thanks for your budgetary efficiency, but also much more importantly, your wonderful insights that were so helpful to the book. Anne Leroyer, who I'm not sure I guess is not here, was the editor. She did her usual thorough job of making sure this was a high quality project and shepherded the book from start to finish and stayed even past her retirement date to get it done. I really appreciate that. And the rest of the publications crew here at Lincoln, Emily, Susan, Marissa, Elaine, thank you so much for all your hard work. To Vern Associates, the book designers and packagers, who kind of turned some sort of a miracle process on this. Last summer we met with Peter Blewas, the designer, and handed him about 1,000, or showed him, little bits and scraps and pieces, and I had about 1,000 graphic image files, some of which were about 6 feet long and 3 inches high, and I couldn't possibly imagine how that could possibly turn into a book or what it might look like on the page, but Peter worked his usual wonderful magic on it and turned it into a thing of beauty. I'd also like to say thanks to my family, and especially to my father, Andrew Campoli, who wanted so much to be here today but wasn't able to come, but will be certainly watching the online show, and I'd like to say hello, Dad, and thanks. I'm going to talk a little bit about what led to the book. I think Armando covered a little bit of it. A bit about what's in it, and I'll talk a little bit about the research process and the field work that I did to write the book. And because it's not a work of fiction, I'm going to reveal the ending. After about 60 years of sprawl, U.S. City seems to be making a comeback. There have been many books written about this topic and much talk, and some piles of emerging evidence that cities hold the key to environmental sustainability and economic prosperity in the 21st century, and that living and working close together in dense networks is essential. But what most of the recent discussions about density haven't dealt with is the physical form that density can take. And this is the view of what a dense city looks like, and that's often sort of put out there in these discussions. It's distant and detached. It's often an aerial photograph that shows high-rises that are closely spaced together, and it's usually seen from the air like this. As Armando mentioned, Alex McLean and I put together a density catalog a couple years ago to show what density looks like at different levels, and it became the book Visualizing Density. And we use that same detached perspective. And it showed very well context and overall form, but as Armando pointed out, some of our readers said that that's not how we experience cities. So Made for Walking answers that concern. It also explains density in urban form, but it does it from the ground, and it shows it in much greater detail. Visualizing Density showed how different design approaches can create different types of places, and there's good density and there's bad density. It can be exactly the same level as these photos of Washington and Staten Island show. With Made for Walking, I decided to focus on only the good examples and to show the spatial structure that can bring so many of those benefits. And these are the statistics, or the numbers, that motivated me in approaching this topic. The U.S. has 4.5% of the world's population, but it contributes 20% of the carbon dioxide that's changing our world's climate. And a third of that carbon emissions come from energy that's used for transportation. And 60% of those transportation emissions come from private automobiles. So if we hope to limit the impending climate disaster, we need to make a significant dent in the 2.9 trillion miles that Americans drive every year. And that's about 14,000 miles per licensed driver. And we're not even having any fun driving all those miles. This is what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be sexy and glamorous and liberating. But this is what it has become. This is Darcy and Bill Hurst. They drive a lot. 2 years ago, they had 2 daughters living at home, and their family drove 630 miles a week. And that was just to get through their daily routine. This is Mark and Sally Russ. 2 years ago, they had 3 children living at home, and they drove 350 miles a week to work, school, lacrosse practice, ballet lessons, the gym, the grocery store, and all the other errands that they had to run. And this is the way most Americans live. It's not exactly cruising in the sunshine with the top down and wind blowing your hair back with a devil-may-care attitude that we were promised in the 1950s. This is the sort of grinding reality of just getting where we need to go every day. And while many Americans spend too much time in the car, it's really hard for them to imagine any kind of alternative. Less common for American families is Eddie Padmo de Pietro and Joe Allegro and their 5 children. 2 years ago, with 4 kids living at home, they performed an even more complex daily ritual than the Hearsts and the Russes, but they drove only about 150 miles a week. And that has everything to do with the built environment that they live in. The Hearsts live in an exurban subdivision in southwestern Washington state. It's a sparsely populated area, and it's far from any services and has a density of about 340 persons per square mile. I mapped their daily destinations, which are shown as red dots. And as you can see from their commute map, they're scattered far and wide. In fact, this is an area that covers about 80 square miles. So every time the Hearsts leave their house, they'd have to drive at least 10 miles to get to where they need to go. They can't carpool, and they can't take shorter trips. And this is where the Russes live, in an inner ring suburb of Houston. Their neighborhood has really small lots, and they have a much denser person per square mile rate. It's 6,200 persons per square mile. And that's about twice as much as the average American city. And they have many more services nearby their house. Mark drives about 20 miles a day to get to his job in a distant suburb, but most of the family's daily destinations take place within about 20 square miles. But they always drive because most of the services are along arterials, and it's not a safe or a pleasant walk. And this is where the Allegro family lives, Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. They rely on the T, buses, and walking to get where they need to go in their daily trips. Their commute map shows a much tighter area of travel. They have a lot of friends in Jamaica Plain, and most of their socializing is within half a mile from their house. And while the impacts of climate change might not yet be personal or direct enough to modify people's driving behavior, the land use transportation problem really starts to hit home and becomes more apparent to the average American when the gas prices rise. The average household spent about $3,000 a year on gas in 2012, and that ties 2008 for the highest percentage in 30 years. So it seems to be that gas prices are just going to keep creeping up. And when people can't afford to fill up their gas tank, or it really cuts into the family budget, they start to look for alternative ways to get around. Unfortunately for the Hearst family, there really aren't any alternatives, and the Russes have a few alternatives. Because the problem is that most of the places that we live, we can take a walk, but we can't walk to get somewhere because that somewhere is just much too far away. As gas becomes more expensive, we find ourselves in a very unforgiving physical landscape. So the central question of the book is, how can we create a lot fewer Houstons and a lot more Jamaica Plains? Just putting people close together won't give people better travel options. And a good example of this is this development in Dallas that has a density of 64 units per acre, which is pretty high for American standards. But given the surroundings of this development, I'm pretty sure that people are not going to be walking anywhere from that apartment building. So density alone is not the solution. And to paraphrase a 1960s cigarette commercial, it's not how dense you make it, it's how you make it dense. It's the spatial distribution of that density that really matters. There's been a lot of research lately into the relationship between urban form and travel behavior. And in addition to density, which is what was originally seen as the big factor, researchers are finding many other factors that are in play in the urge to get people out of their cars. They are density, diversity, distance to transit, destination accessibility, design, and parking, which could not be made into a conveniently D starting word. So we're calling it 5 Ds and a P. I describe the Ds in the book and show what they look like in real places, such as diversity, and this is an example from Toronto. Within this couple hundred of feet or yards in Toronto, you can send a fax, buy some flowers, buy some plantains, buy some paint, buy a new outfit without really walking very far down the street. And those arrangement of uses are shown along commercial corridors, commercial shopping streets in Toronto. So it's all very closely spaced. So this kind of diversity can help people avoid car trips. And then there's distance to transit. The shorter the distance between home and the transit stop, the subway stop, or the bus stop, the more likely people are to take that transit option. This is a transit-oriented development in Pasadena, California, and it's wonderful because it just wraps right around the light rail station, so you can just walk downstairs. Or you can take the elevator, which is by far and away the most unsung hero of transit. It is safer and more energy efficient than any other transit mode. And the thing that most planners don't understand is that it also operates the most opportunities for drama. Destination accessibility, being close to where you need to go, is probably the most, I think it's the most important factor. And a good example of this is in Denver, where downtown Denver has a rail line, a river, and an interstate highway just to the northwest. And there's a neighborhood on the other side of those barriers called the Highland neighborhood. And in the last 10 or 15 years, the city has built pedestrian bridges over those barriers. And as a result, they've made the Highland neighborhood much more desirable. And so they provided the residents of Highland neighborhood with destination accessibility. And then, of course, design, which is a much more complicated thing to provide, but making sure that the environment is human scaled and designed well, safe, comfortable, and attractive. And I'll be talking more about that. And then parking. It's the lack of parking that's important here. Changing the policies that reward driving and limiting the amount of space that's allocated to cars, not only on streets, but within city blocks. So the bulk of the book looks at real places, and it illustrates the type of urban form that we need to lower vehicle miles traveled. And it focuses on 12 neighborhoods that are made for walking. It shows how they're put together and a glimpse of the life on the streets. And some of the structure that's illustrated in the book for each of these neighborhoods, I'll show here. This is a diagram that shows how many intersections are within a certain area, 130 acres in the Pearl District of Portland. When there are a high density of intersections and the blocks are small, that gives people a lot of route choices, and they can take turns and make choices, and makes them for a much more interesting walk. So intersection density is important, and small blocks. Also pedestrian infrastructure. Where do the sidewalks connect, and do they connect to open spaces and interconnected green spaces? And buildings that align to form highly defined street edges, and how all these components come together to make the urban fabric of a place like the Pearl District, and the form that makes them appealing, the architecture, the parks, the trees, the shops, as well as the density context that makes transit and services possible and allows people to enjoy the benefits. This section of the Pearl District has a density of persons per square mile of 16,000 people, which is high for US standards, but very important to provide the services. And then the different types of commercial services that are in the neighborhood and how they're arranged and what sort of pattern. It's interesting to hold up the services map of the Pearl District versus the Greenpoint neighborhood in Brooklyn, because although both neighborhoods offer a variety of services, they're arranged differently. Neither one is good or bad, it's just different. So these 12 neighborhoods offer a much lower carbon footprint because they allow their residents to drive less, but they're not as green as they could be. So in the book I include a profile of a new neighborhood in Vancouver, British Columbia, that is designed to run without fossil fuels. And it's important to note neighborhoods like this, because as we build new neighborhoods, it's really crucial that we build them with a lower carbon footprint. This neighborhood is all designed around the idea of limiting environmental impacts. It has a stormwater system that captures and recycles runoff. The building systems are intended to operate on maximum efficiency. They have a biomass energy plant, and they have a district heating and cooling system set up, and they have many other features that can help the residents there reduce their carbon footprint, including rooftop vegetable gardens and bicycle storage rooms. They discourage the use of cars. They discourage car ownership. And the whole neighborhood is laid out, the layout, the building systems, the water, the wastewater operations are designed to make a low-impact lifestyle not only easy and convenient, but part of a good life. So here's why we should be encouraged. There are lots of indicators that there will be many more neighborhoods that are made for walking. First of all, the real estate market is changing, and the ground seems to have shifted under the last recession, and Americans are changing their mind about what they want. In surveys are showing that Americans still want single-family homes, but they're willing to have much less square footage if it's in exchange for a much more convenient neighborhood. So although we're not ready to trade, we are ready to trade in our big homes if we are able to walk to the store. Another bit of evidence is that we seem to be getting too old for sprawl. A lot more of us are over 65 now than there were in the last 10 years, and twice as many of us by 2050 will be between 65 and 100 years old. And low-density suburbs are not the best place to age. So as boomers sell off their houses, they're going to be looking for smaller houses and apartments in less car-dependent places. 15 years from now, the average, one-third of households are going to have only one person in them. I mean, think about that. That's a very, very big demographic shift from what was driving the suburban build-out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. 10% of households are going to have children, that's all. And the baby boomers, as they retire, are going to be looking to live in much more exciting urban environments. And then there are the millennials, which we hear so much about. Nathan Heller wrote an article in the New Yorker about a month ago, and he said, well, they're either the web-savvy master race trying to steal your job and drive up the price of your housing stock, or they're living in your basement, eating all your shredded wheat, and failing to be even marginally employed. So it's hard to know what the impact of the millennials are going to be on the future, but we do have some statistics that say that as of now, 3/4 of 20-somethings want to live in urban cores, and they're not desperate to own a car like their parents were at the same age, and they're not even getting their licenses. It's a much lower license acquisition rate for this generation than in any previous generation. That's a very interesting development. Millennials are moving to places like Brooklyn and Portland and Boston in droves. And the ones that aren't moving to those magnets are staying in the other cities, and they're making their impact on those. Places like Cleveland and Dallas and St. Louis, they're creating their own little islands of urbanism by colonizing old neighborhoods and inner-ring suburbs. And they're starting businesses, and they're becoming urban activists, and they're demanding better pedestrian amenities and bike infrastructure. And for at least for now, they just want to stay put in the cities. Here's the latest evidence that millennials are not interested in cars. It's the explosive growth of curbside bus service, like Megabus and Bolt Bus. A recent study showed that the people that are using these are young. About half of them are under 25, and 3/4 of them are under 35. And I know this because I take Megabus a lot, and I'm always struck by the fact that it's easy to find a seat in the front. Everyone wants to sit in the back. And now I know it's because it's all kids. They want to stay away from the bus driver. Unlike older bus service, curbside bus services leave and arrive from the central city locations, and they don't stop in between. So they're really focused on areas that are served by transit. It's much easier to get by when you don't have a car, when there's an inner city bus service that's so cheap and convenient. So in researching this, I wanted to use existing places to illustrate design and planning ideas. And I wanted to find walkable cities and neighborhoods across North America. So I asked the question, where can you live happily without a car? And I didn't mean just getting by without a car, because a lot of people do that, but it's not such a great life. So where can you live happily without a car? And I found that not many places. It was much easier to find that 100 years ago, or even 60 years ago. Everywhere was made for walking. I just watched 2 movies recently that took place in Los Angeles, mid-century. And I was struck by how urban the settings were, given that it was Los Angeles. The first one was Big Sleep, and I noticed that Philip Marlowe drives his coupe around the Hollywood Hills, but most of the action takes place in very urban settings, like his office that exists upstairs above a shop. And, oops, I don't know what happened to that. When we get to, there he is. And then also Singing in the Rain from 1952. When you watch that, you think, oh, that must be Paris, but it takes place, the action takes place in Los Angeles. And I thought, well, this is just kind of an idealized view of what, you know, the city is, certainly the Singing in the Rain one. But I found some footage of Los Angeles in the 1940s, and what really struck me was just the large amounts of pedestrians on the street and the streetcars. That's a lot of people. And then this footage taken from 1947, and the thing I want you to notice is that this is a car that's driving along the street, lighting up the buildings along the street with a spotlight, so it's a little bit hard to watch, but the thing I want you to notice is just how continuous that edge of streets are. In all of the small businesses, in the human scale retail, it just goes on and on. Actually, this movie is much longer, and I was just struck by how uninterrupted this urban fabric is and how much Los Angeles has changed. I mean, I was there looking for walkable neighborhoods, and it sure doesn't look like this anymore. So like so many other US neighborhoods, the densities were much higher. And this was revealed well by Sally Angel in the book Making Room for Planet of Cities, and some of the work he's done here at Lincoln, showing that the US cities have lost a lot of their density, and along with that, a lot of their pedestrians. 100 years ago, the average American city, the average density in city was 18,000 people per square mile. And now it's declined to about 3,700. So that's a significant drop. And the thing that's problematic with that is that they don't have the kind of densities they're going to be able to support transit. You need about 7,000 persons per square mile, and he found that almost half of the cities in the U.S. have no areas within their boundaries that reach that level. So here are the criteria that I was set to find out, to choose the neighborhoods that I wanted to study. It's kind of a long list. Enough people to support density, support transit, close to downtown for that destination accessibility, mix of uses, housing mix, convenient service, meaning it didn't just come every half an hour, it had to come at least 15 minutes, the bus or the train. Was there recent infill development? Is it sort of locked in time, or is it a neighborhood that's evolving that would have examples of new development, and something that's walkable, meaning a pedestrian environment? So WalkScore was a really good tool for me to use. I checked that first. And these are the cities that they said were the most walkable in the country. And it's where you'd expect. It's the older, transit-rich cities in New England and the Northeast, like New York, Philadelphia, and a few others, Chicago. And increasingly in the Northwest, like Seattle and Portland, where walkability has been embraced and systematically pursued. And WalkScore was a useful resource because it really is based on proximity of services and destinations. So I wanted to find examples of more than the usual places, not just the Northeast and the Northwest. So I rephrased the question, where can you live happily with occasional or limited use of a car? And I looked for pockets of walkability, not just whole cities, where you could meet many of your daily needs without driving, even if you did have to have a car. And Jeff Speck, who's the author of a recent book called Walkable Cities, nicely sums up the the characteristics of a walkable neighborhood and his general theory of walkability. And he says if the environment is right, the walk is useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting. And so while Walk Score was a good starting point because it measures convenience, it doesn't really reveal much about safety or comfort or visual interest. And a good example of that is West Hollywood, California, which was noted as one of the most walkable, actually more walkable than Cambridge, Mass. So I went there to see how it measures up on those other qualities. And it turns out that it's, useful. There are stores there, and it's safe because there are sidewalks and crosswalks, and it's relatively comfortable because the streets are quiet, but it's not very interesting. And that's a really important part of all of this. And aerial views tell you a lot. They can show the building pattern in the urban context and but it doesn't really tell you how it feels to be a pedestrian. So this block in Seattle is a good example of that. Those buildings form very continuous street edges, but when you get down on the ground, there are a lot of garages and there's not any retail or anything, so the streets are a little bit dead. Or this development that looks great from the air with this sort of formal open space, but it didn't feel that comfortable or that interesting when I got to it on the street. When I visited these places, I did not rent cars. I made a point of taking buses and public transit. I traveled with a fold-up bike, and because I wanted an out-of-car experience. I wanted to slow down and look very carefully at what was there. And it was really useful to not have a car because I noticed things that people, that you wouldn't notice if you're in the car. For example, the sidewalk with the trees that were planted right in the middle. When I was trying to get up that on foot, I realized just how incredibly dumb it was to put those trees in the middle of the sidewalk. But if you're just driving across the bridge, you think, oh, nice trees. So this is where I went, locations all over the US and a few in Canada, and I checked out all the neighborhoods that rated high on Walk Score, or had recent infill projects, or had interesting building pattern that was shown in the aerials. And I had a GPS track on my bike. These are the tracks from Vancouver. So as you can see, I circled and circled and circled and went to as many neighborhoods as I could. And I looked for places that were interesting and visually memorable. And I wanted to show whole streets, not just little fragments of the street. So I took a series of photographs every 20 feet, walking down the street, and I kept going as long as the street remained interesting. If there wasn't an empty lot or a big parking garage, I just sort of kept taking photographs. And it was a really interesting process because it made me understand the importance of an uninterrupted street, of an urban fabric. That visual interest that just continues and continues is a big component of what makes a street pleasant to walk along. So I stitched those together into one long montage that gives a multiple one-point perspectives all the way down the street. So it's a sequence, but it's shown it all at once, and it's sort of similar to how a pedestrian would experience a street. And this is what you can see in the book. By stitching those photos together, you can see things that are going on in the block, interesting intersecting streets, or the rhythm of open spaces and building openings along the street. And when you hold them side by side, you can consider what makes a street interesting or not interesting. The differences between small lot development, like the older street in Denver at the top, and large lot development versus the new infill section of Denver, where the whole building covers the whole parcel, which covers the whole block. There's been a real attempt to make it an interesting building, but when it's all the same going down the street, it doesn't hold up as well. And it's one of the challenges of contemporary developments. How do you make those large floor plates have the same kind of visual interest as the older neighborhoods? Or the problems that you come with when there's just not a lot of openings in the building, or doorways or windows. How much less interesting those buildings tie together along the street. And how the longest montages show that intact urban fabric. This is a street in Brooklyn where it never stopped being interesting. Well, it did, but not for several blocks. I just took photograph after photograph when I crossed many streets, and I was able to continue to shoot, and it ended up with one of those 6-foot long by 3-inch high montages. So I'm going to finish with the 5 broad themes that emerge from the research and in which the book illustrates. And first is the crucial role of transportation, because how we move determines the shape and the scale and the quality of our cities. We have environmental, economic, health reasons to drive less. But shifting away from cars to other transportation modes is the single most important strategy to make better cities and towns. If we're moving by foot or bike or bus or train, we will be able to get the scale right. I believe now, after doing this work, I mean, I sort of believed this before, but I really believe it now, that this sustainable transportation hierarchy is the key. If we adhere to this when we have policy discussions, then I believe that good things will come. Every neighborhood that I selected that met the criteria was built before cars. I didn't really want it to be that way, but it ended up being that way. I think it's because they were scaled and designed for people moving by foot. Some had filled in recently, but they were built next to or alongside a historic pattern. I looked for greenfield developments. I looked at lifestyle centers. I went to Stapleton and Denver and Belmar and Orenco Station and many other sort of new towns and greenfield developments, but I couldn't find that critical mass of people and services in close proximity. Now that might be because they haven't been fully built out or for whatever reason, but I suspect it's because they were built with cars as the primary form of transportation. So if you have the car at the top, then you're going to get you might be able to get a small isolated fragment of this type of neighborhood, but you can't get a whole city, and you can't even get a whole neighborhood that has this quality. And one of the biggest reasons is parking. Take, for example, Cleveland. It's a really great place to park. There's an abundance of surface parking lots. Parking garages are everywhere. It's also a great place to drive because the roads are highly engineered for speed. But it's not a great place to be because most of the space is devoted to the storage of cars or the movement of cars. There are a few developers and activists who are really trying to turn it into something else and see the potential to make it into a much greater place and a place to be that's more bikeable and walkable. But as long as they have the same parking requirements and regulations, they're never really going to get there because there just simply isn't enough space. The places that are succeeding are making bold moves in the direction of that sustainable transportation hierarchy. Places like New York City that are resetting the priorities. They're not making little baby steps. They're doing big moves. Researchers are crunching the numbers on how to do this, but the New York City Department of Transportation, they're just doing their own experiments. They're out there changing lanes and putting in temporary plazas and then permanent plazas, and they're finding ways to reclaim the streets, and people are responding. And this is not just happening in New York, it's happening in Chicago and Washington and even places like West Palm Beach, Florida. This is Lancaster, California. This is what the main drag looked like in 2007. It really was a place to drag. And they wanted more people downtown, so they took out this 5 lanes of traffic and they reduced it to 2 lanes with a wide tree-lined Ramblas in the middle and turned it into a boulevard. And they made it safer. The traffic collisions were cut in half and the injuries dropped by 85%. They brought prosperity to downtown, became a magnet for development. They spent $11.5 million on it and they got $130 million back in private investment. The revenues from downtown doubled, and the property, even though property values dipped everywhere else in town, they rose by 10% in the downtown area. And this is all because they created a place to be instead of a place to drive through. So here's a simple test of whether a development project or a zoning plan or a transportation improvement or whatever it is you're considering is a good idea. Does it make sense? If gas costs $5 or $8 or $10 a gallon, because we don't really think in terms of environmental impacts or long-term future, all those sort of highfalutin things. We really think about pocketbook issues. So if it's not really going to hold up, if it's not designed to be in a place where people don't have to drive that much or can't get to where they need to go, then it doesn't make sense. So the number 2, mind the gaps, rebuilding the urban fabric, and this is just at the micro scale and at the macro scale, filling in the empty lots with multi-story, multi-use buildings, so you get that continuous urban fabric. Burlington, Vermont, where I'm from, they're doing that. They want to create more housing downtown. And it looks from the map on the left that the downtown is built out, but by looking more carefully, you can see there are many, many gaps in that pattern. There are many opportunities to create housing units. And here's an example of filling in the mall and the urban renewal site from the 1970s with new housing. This is what the city is working towards, adding stories and filling in the gaps. And then an example of this, a really broad scale, is what Washington metro area is doing by targeting growth at the expanding metro system hubs. And a good example of that specifically is Tyson's Corner, which has plans to turn this very low density, very sprawling interchange development into something much more urban and walkable and dense. So changing the way we move and filling the gaps with useful services and housing will help recalibrate our sense of scale. And it'll help us focus on proximity, which I think is a much better word than density, because it expresses it in a much broader way. It's not just people and housing, it's about the arrangement and the layout of activities within a small area. And design makes a really, really big difference. I think people will be much more cheerful about living together if their surroundings are beautiful and the details are attended to. Vancouver has a very vigorous approach to urban design. They require developers to contribute a lot to the public realm, and it's really paid off. Because even though it's one of the highest density cities in North America, it has consistently ranks as one of the most livable. And I think that has a lot to do with the high level of design in the public spaces there. And New York City parks are another example. They used to look pretty shabby, and in the last 10 years they not only have fixed them up, but they have ratcheted up the standard for what the design of those public spaces will be like. And an example of that is the High Line, which everybody loves and celebrates, and many other parks in the cities. And these kind of public spaces that are really very well designed are drawing people back into the cities. But despite that, the physical environment is really just a foundation. As trained as a designer, it's been hard for me to internalize this, and I think it's hard for architects and landscape architects to realize that it's not just about the buildings and the street, it's about the people. Because unlike parks, great neighborhoods only begin with design. They can't be designed. The urban experience depends on the communities that we build and the institutions that we create. And that's why they're so wonderfully different from each other. Made for Walking provides a checklist for the planning and design strategies that we need to make neighborhoods more walkable, but it only lays a framework. Because great neighborhoods and great cities evolve over time. But here's what seems like a recipe for success. Just focus on what everybody wants. They want health, companionship, convenience, and beauty. So that in the end, we'll end up with places where we're not as dependent on cars and we have a lower carbon emission and all those wonderful environmental things, but we're actually just making people happy by providing wonderful environments. We're never going to convince people like the Hearst to move into town. They never questioned their decision through all of my interviews with them, and they never flinched at the price of gas going up. They love where they live. So as long as there are people like the Hearst out there that continue to absorb the cost of gas, there will be exurbs, and there will be suburbs, and there will be long commutes. But the Russes are ready for a change. Sally is really tired of driving everywhere, and she wants to walk. And she spent a month living in Boston last summer, and so she is determined that as soon as the kids are all at school, she's going to move to a walkable neighborhood. She's going to jump into this pedicab and not look back. Thank you.
I think we have time for some interaction before we move on to the next part of the event. So if anybody'd like to comment or question, please.
Yes, hi, Julie.
Hi.
I'm Jamie Mullen. I'm from the Berkshire Regional Planning Commission in Berkshire County.
Oh, Berkshire County. I grew up in Pittsfield.
Oh, you did? That's considered, I think, a gateway city, which is now trying its best to reinterpret itself after being their biggest employer is General Electric, which has since subsequently left, and the city's been struggling ever since. But they're renewing themselves on the rebound, as
I'm very happy to hear that.
most cities are. One of the things that I think you might need to include in highlighting the car culture is the cost of owning a car per year. I think the last time I checked, the AAA, which is in the car boosting business,
Admitted that it was high.
and came up with a figure of something like $9,000 or $10,000 a year to own one car.
Right, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, if the gas was $3,000 in 2012.
With insurance and all the other sundry things that go along with owning it. So that's pretty important. If you could.
Which is why they're thinking that the millennials are not interested.
Well, you could leverage that $10,000 into a $100,000 mortgage.
Right, and there are programs called locally efficient mortgages where you're given credit for living in a place where you don't need a car. You can get more boring power in your house.
So that's an incredible amount of savings each year. So the family could use with one less car or not own a car at all. I mean, it's a very powerful economic statement in very precarious economic times.
Yes.
The other thing is, just at the end, what did you call it, a pedicab?
Pedicab.
Transportation choices, or the option to have multiple modal choices to get around a city is also sometimes difficult. Aren't there regulatory conflicts between cab unions and other city regulations that sort of prevent that kind of innovative modality?
I think that all depends on the city. I think cities that want to make it happen are taking the steps to set the regulations in favor of them. But yeah, I'm sure there's some conflicts like that. But I don't know of any with pedicabs. But there's things you have to work through. We just talked to Jeanette Sadik-Khan, who's the transportation commissioner in New York City, that has leaped over many hurdles and taken a lot of political hits along the way, but has succeeded. And it's wonderful that they have led the way, because they're showing that it's possible, and people are seeing the benefits and saying, well, yeah, that's great, let's have some of that in our town.
More of that. Yeah. Thank you.
Please.
Hi, my name is Patrick McKeffey, and my question for you is, there are a lot of suburbs that were laid out in a more walkable fashion before World War II. What are the prospects for these types of small towns, and which of your strategies can be applied best to them?
I think the ones that are laid out, you said the ones before World War II?
Yes.
Or the ones after?
Before.
The ones before are the easiest ones, because the bones are already there. They have the small blocks and the sidewalks and the connected street networks. A place like Pittsfield, my dad lives there, and I go there a lot. And it's interesting because he read the book first when it came out, and he said, well, this is interesting, but people don't really want to give up their cars. They just like driving everywhere. And I pointed out to him that in 1959, when he chose to build a house, he didn't go out to the edge of town like everyone else was. He built it, half a mile from the city center and an infill lot. And when he got his office, he chose it 1 block from the courthouse. And I said, you did that, didn't you? He said, well, I needed to walk there in a hurry. But that was his reality, was that you walk everywhere, because he had grown up within walking distance of everywhere. Even though, he likes to drive, he's always made choices so that he doesn't need to drive. And he wasn't even aware that he had done this. So I just think that, I don't think it's going to be hard to if you make the place comfortable to do it. I don't think people, and you give them the transit options that are convenient, I don't think people are going to dig their heels in and not want to do it. But it's just much harder to create that system. But I think those pre-war ones, that's the easiest problem to solve. It's the low-density suburbs out by the interchange that, it's just very difficult to think of how do you make those right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm noticing this is the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm happy to live in a community where I can walk for everything I need, but in the process of doing so, I notice a lot of underutilized land in prime commercial areas. I consider parking lots examples of land banking, and I walk by a lot of that. And I just wonder if you have any policy suggestions for communities that could stimulate.
I was just reading about this, and I'm sorry I don't have the accurate memory of what it was. But if you give me your card after all. But cities like Minneapolis, the slide I showed of the parking lot was in Minneapolis. I don't know whether you've been to downtown Minneapolis, but there's just many, many surface parking lots that are sitting there empty, and it's a very frustrating problem for the city because they are just kind of used to sit there. But I think either they are about to, or they have just recently changed their tax policy. So they're taxing that land. It's not just Minneapolis, another city as well. They're taxing land very differently to get those parking lots into development. Armando, do you know about that?
Well, I was going to say, we did a little work in Cleveland, what we call, and those surface parking lots can raise a lot of revenue for the owners of the parking lots. So they are kind of land banking, but they're also giving an economic return. But certainly, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy would be very interested in thinking about taxing land as a way of having an effect on its use. Somebody lit up, I think.
Yeah, that was me. I had read something, I think it was on Pittsburgh in particular, has a tax policy that I think was in place even before World War II, where they essentially tax land, not buildings, so that you have no incentive to knock down a building to reduce your tax rate, so you can just sort of skim off the parking revenue.
Right.
And it's an incentive to keep buildings up or to develop land if you have it in the city core.
Pittsburgh was one of the places, and the state of Pennsylvania was one of the places that authorized having a differential tax rate on improved land and land that was not built on.
It's called like two-rate. There was a
two-rate taxes. Yeah. And it's one of the few examples of that in the United States.
Yeah, unfortunately, Pittsburgh had a very poor assessment, and so people's property taxes were all over the place, and they actually have no longer used that
Is that the
effectively.
case?
It's gone now, but Pittsburgh's doing pretty well now, actually, so for other reasons. I saw something about Rosemary.
I thought it was interesting that the greenfield developments that you looked at, like Stapleton and Orenco Station, didn't come out so well. So you said maybe it's because they're not yet built out and they're still in process, but did they get the 5 Ds and a P right?
They didn't.
The foundation.
They didn't seem to have the services. They had a few coffee shops and maybe a yoga studio in the middle of the town center. Lots of housing around it. But what I observed was that people were just, driving from their unit somewhere else to work and somewhere else to do most of their shopping because there just wasn't enough there. And I don't know whether that was the problem of the initial development. I don't think that Peter Calthorpe would have overlooked the idea that you need a lot of commercial. I just think they couldn't get the tenants for whatever reason. But that was and I found the same with the Orenco Station, which was a very pleasant environment, but it just didn't have, just couldn't live there without a car, as it is now, even though it's built on the light rail line. The light rail station is much farther away from the center of town than I expected that it would be.
Yes, sir.
I actually lived in Denver during the time that was all planned out. I was one of the last people to fly out of Stapleton, actually, before they shut it down. But in any case, the roots of the project go far enough back that all of the thinking that we have now about walkability and transit, like light rail in Denver, absolutely did not exist then. And it was really, I think, for as good as the intentions were, it was perceived as like sort of a dense suburb, a dense place to live, but wherever you worked, down the tech center, et cetera, you would still get there by car.
Right, right. And it's hard for developers, you know, when you put something out in Greenfield to not put the parking lots, because they don't really have faith that their customers are going to use another transit mode if it doesn't exist at that time. It's a leap of faith that's just really hard to make.
Yes.
So to dovetail that, when developers actually do want to eliminate the inclusion of parking, they can run into the problem that regulations enshrine required minimum parking. And in fact, perhaps residents or neighborhoods buy into that over time because they don't remember it any other way. There's a development in Boston that tried to build 44 units with no parking and write into the lease that the tenants would not be allowed to own a car. However, this was disallowed, and I'm wondering where there are efforts, where there may be signs of progress to allow eliminating parking requirements.
I think you look at the cities that have the critical mass of density now that have been able to do that, like Portland and New York City, well, Portland doesn't have as much density, but they've got very progressive regulations. But the places that have existing density, they can get away with it and they can be models. But Donald Shoup at UC Berkeley has done great work, and I think he's going to become the go-to source for all these municipalities that are trying to do this, because he's got all that information and the cause and effect of the policies and how they promote or discouraged economic activity and jobs, and then also smarter ways to do parking so you can maximize the number of spaces for the number of people, and there's just a whole range of choices and options.
So it's not totally unheard of to see maximum parking requirements as opposed to minimum parking requirements.
Right.
Yeah, and more cities are embracing that.
Yes, right.
I had some other questions, but just following up on that, Boulder, Colorado is a good example where they were trying to reduce parking with also putting programs like eco passes, where employers would get bus pass or other forms of transit to, not use the vehicle and not use the car and encourage more walking. But my question was, did you also look or know of studies in there about priorities that communities have about making more of a walkable city, and also from perspectives of seniors and elderly and handicapped, as well as gender differences, looking at a walkable city from a female's perspective versus a male perspective? Safety issue comes up a little bit more, lighting, night issues versus looking at a city during the daylight.
I experienced all that from going to them. I thought about that a lot, but no, I did not. I haven't done that research, and it would be great. It would be great to have the sequel address those.
I thought I heard a volume 3. Woman's Guide to Walking.
I did write about Boulder's parking demand management program in the book too. It's a great one, great example.
Okay, there's food and drink out there, I can tell. Stopped asking questions. Well, thank Joey for a great presentation.
Thank you.